Morning. Apologies for how late this is. I was preoccupied with JGs for the last few moons. As you all might know, JGs is the biggest time sink for any debate coach in the calendar year. So again, my apologies. We're here to discuss EDC round one. All the other EDC videos should already be up on the channel. And SSSDC round two, round three, and NUSPA videos will be out in the next 2 weeks. But for now, we have to talk about Ukraine and Europe. And the first thing I want to acknowledge is that this being a prepared round, the likelihood is you all have spent a lot of time researching this topic already. I don't think I'm going to be saying anything revolutionary as a result. But instead, what I want to try and focus on is some broad framing devices that I think will make the difference if teams do an equal amount of research. I think for any prepared round, research is the most important thing. More so than perhaps writing arguments even. And this is probably a controversial opinion. The reason for this is because there's so many academic articles, journals, opinion pieces, news broadcasts, documentaries on many of the prepared round topics. Movies even sometimes, right? And I feel like a lot of those material is the way in which you get an advantage over your opponent, because they help inspire you to come up with new ideas and new arguments. They give you new angles, not to just throw at the judge, right? Not to just say I know this or I know that, but they give you new perspectives that if you have the skills to, you can twist and mold into things that resemble a debate case that is more favorable to your side. So with prepared rounds, sometimes you might think, well, my coach is telling me this argument works, that argument works. What is my role in all of this besides just listening to what my coach has to say? I would say the best thing that a team can do is, bunker down for a weekend, hunker down, I don't know. And just do a lot of research and read journal articles, go to the library if you can. If you have access to JSTOR or university catalogs, use them. They will help. And while not everything will be useful, they will inspire you to have some more material in the debate. So that's something to consider. So when I think about this motion, I think about a few things. Broadly, my thoughts can be crystallized into three areas. The first is, what is the interest of EU countries? Like, what do they actually want? What are they looking for? Okay, sorry, my mic was a bit weird. So anyway, what's the interest of EU countries? What are they, what do they want? So obviously there is an active debate to some extent. The interests of EU countries matter because the motion is about the interests of EU countries. The second question is, what is significantly increased military aid? What is it used for? What can it do? How much is it? And the third question, I think a lot of teams did surprisingly miss out on in the actual round is, what's the end goal? Like, what is trying to be achieved here? Like, what is the situation you want to create as a result of giving or not giving this increased military aid? So we'll explore these three questions. But I also want you all to realize that none of these questions are necessarily like an argument by itself. There's no one argument that's just like, my first argument is the interest of EU countries, right? That's not how it works. But I think what this can do is give you some starting points for what you want to research on, and potentially might guide you towards your eventual arguments as well. All right. So when I think about the interests of EU countries, and most countries as a whole. I think there are three broad things that always come to mind, and this is generally useful in any geopol or pseudo geopol round. The first is security. Why is that important? Well, countries like to stay countries. They don't like it when other governments take over. They don't like losing their sovereignty because then they're not a country anymore. And the purpose of a state is so we can make independent decisions. So security matters, right? The direct threat to EU countries exists in the eastern front of the EU. Countries like Poland are on the border of Ukraine. If Ukraine is, falls, there is a direct line of attack, right, to EU countries. Also, one thing that is interesting about Europe, right, is that most of the border with Russia is quite mountainous, quite hard to navigate, except for that stretch of flat land that comprises Ukraine, which is why, again, it is so strategically important for Russia, but also strategically important for the EU, right? Because if Russia has access to that piece of flat land, you can fairly easily go into Poland if you want to. The second thing is that there is a encroachment on Europe, right? Like it's just closer to Europe now, closer to EU countries. Russia will be, and a hostile, party will be closer to EU countries. That could be seen as an indirect threat for numerous reasons, which we'll explore later. There's also the economic interest. Now it's very evident that there is a possible global financial crisis on the horizon, with the collapse of SVB. But even I think 2 months ago, it was very clear, 2 months ago being when EDC was, it was very clear that things were not great in the financial markets. If you are Europe right now, you probably want to think about having money in your reserves to bail out startups, bail out banks, or at the very least, pump money into your own domestic economy to cover for the fact that the banks might be on a run sometime in the next year. Again, maybe this is more obvious now in hindsight because of what's going on with SVB. But I think it was a fairly reasonable argument to make even during EDC. There's also the energy crisis. Who caused it? What's causing it? Right? Do you need Russian oil? The facts are that EU countries are facing very strong inflationary pressure because a lot of them used to rely on Russian energy, and that supply has been obviously dwindling or being cut. So that's one of the big economic concerns of the EU right now as well. And then finally, I think influence, political influence, right? The most obvious political argument is the domestic argument, right? The EU wants to stay together, wants to prevent infighting. You have a lot of separatist movements, dissatisfaction from smaller states who think they're getting a raw deal from the EU. That's, a bit more of specific context. But also, I think what the EU likes having is soft power. Unlike other big powers like Russia, China, even America, the EU derives its power from its ability to have regulations and rules for global trade. So what this means is that they like setting regulations, right? And the idea is that because they're such a big trading bloc, the regulations that the EU sets up sort of diffuses itself into the rest of the global trading ecosystem. So they are by far the toughest international actor when it comes to regulating big tech. Google, Apple have been on the receiving end of numerous lawsuits and regulatory actions by the EU that doesn't happen in America. So this is where I think they're trying to maintain a lot of their power and their relevance on the global stage. So that's what I think is important, right? Like you probably can sell those things as important. And financial interests, security, influence will always be important, I think, in any geopolitical debate. I did hear this one interesting idea from some teams, which is this like the EU loves human rights and they like really want to uphold human rights. I'm not sure how easy it is to weigh this argument well in the debate. While it is probably true that the EU cares more about human rights than many other countries, um, has that outweighed domestic interests? Probably not. Case in point, the Syrian migrants, right? The UK, who's obviously not part of the EU anymore, very happy to send the illegal migrants back to Rwanda on boats. During the refugee crisis, the Syrian refugee crisis, many migrants drowned in the channel outside France, at the Mediterranean Sea as well. If you really care about human rights, those things probably wouldn't happen. So I think the issue here is that in a debate, super hard to sell that this is more important than all the other interests. What I think you can do if you want to run a strong human rights argument is to tie this to the diplomacy argument, right? So the EU maintains its legitimacy by looking like a bastion for human rights. That gives it more soft power, which then gives it regulatory setting ability. It also keeps them like on the USA's good side, so they can keep the US as an important ally. So they don't want to like do stuff that makes the US unhappy, especially when it comes to human rights, because they need the US on their side to repel Russia. So that might be a better strategic angle than just saying that the EU intrinsically cares about human rights. Right, second question then. What is significantly increased military aid? What is it used for? So I think here some context is quite important. And if you didn't do your research, you wouldn't know this. The US is the largest provider of military aid to Ukraine. So when it comes to equipment, tanks, all that fun stuff, the US provides the most of this equipment. What the EU provides the most of is financial aid. They do give some military equipment, but they focus a lot on financial assistance, basically giving the Ukraine money. Now, there's a few caveats here that are obviously quite important. The first is that some of that money will probably go towards buying military equipment anyway. So there is a kind of overlap, right, between financial and military aid. So there's part of this financial aid probably is military aid already. But the second thing is the reason why they give so much in the form of financial aid is because given where the Ukraine is and its location, there's a lot of like debt that the Ukraine may owe their neighbors, and owe Europe as well, from just the intricacies of international trade. We all owe everyone money. Like that's how global trading works, right? And so what a lot of this financial aid is the EU basically saying, you don't have to pay us your debt. You don't have to pay us the interest on your debt for the next like 2 years, right? So we write off that debt, right? Basically, and we that is our version of financial aid to you, which is useful, right? Maybe not as useful as tanks, but useful nonetheless. So the next thing is, and this is where I had a spirited discussion with the Edge Core. What would constitute a significant increase? Is 10% significant? Is 20% significant? Is 100% significant? And is it immediate? Also, so what's the time scale here? Because aid isn't just given, all at one shot, right? For the EU, it's been always been given over a period of time. So one of my questions when I was running through this debate for my teams was, let's say the EU gave like 100 billion, that's unrealistic, 50 billion, right, in aid from February 2022 to January 2023. So in the one calendar year, they give 50 billion in aid. This aid was given across a time period of like 12 months, right? Would a significant increase mean that today, the EU pledges to give an extra 50 billion for the next 12 months? Because that would be an increase in the total amount, but it would be the same as the trend would be the same, right? Which is 50 billion a year. So it increases the amount, but it doesn't increase the trend of how much money is going into the Ukraine. Is it that they give 50 billion in one calendar year, and then this next calendar year they pledge to give 100 billion? That would be a significant increase in the trend, right? But because now that money is going in immediately, it's not the case that they're getting a lot more immediately, right? It's happening over the next 12 months. Or is it just right now, at this point of time, we've given 50 billion, we're going to throw in an extra 10 billion to give instantaneously right now? That will be a significant increase in the amount right now, obviously. And there'll be no discussion about the trend, right? So basically, it's just we'll give 10 billion at this exact point of time. Ultimately, the Edge Core sort of decided that it was the third interpretation, which I had some issues with, largely because I don't think it's realistic, but that's what fiat is for, right, in a debate. So, like, because fiat exists, we can assume that this money can be given to the Ukraine in that period of time. And I think that I have no problems with that, right? That makes for a fair debate. What I want to note, though, is that all these interpretations are possible interpretations of the motion. So if the Edge Core didn't clarify this, there's room to play with on Gov as to what significantly increase actually means. And I think it will actually be a fair debate, regardless of which of these scenarios you present to your opponents. So that could be one of the tools in Gov's toolboxes of like not allowing Op to prepare very much for what Gov might be saying in this debate. If I was on Gov, I would use that to my advantage. Finally, and this is the third core question, what is the end goal? What does the EU actually want to achieve with this military aid? One of the things that I observed when going through the round, this was a under-examined part of the debate. It almost seems as though teams are just like saying things that they want, without showing how military aid gets you there. So like, we want to end the war. So we give them Leopard tanks and then the war will end. I'm not sure how that works, right? We want Putin to come to the negotiating table, so we don't give military aid. And then that would make Putin happier, and then he'll come negotiate with us. In both of these situations, what is lacking is that like crucial link, right? Like, what else are you doing to get the outcome that you want? How are you so certain that military aid, whether you give it or not, is the critical thing, the critical tipping point that makes your end goal possible or much easier to achieve versus making it much harder to achieve on the other side if you do the opposite? I think that part of the debate went like quite under-examined in many rooms. And it's a big point of improvement, I think, for any team, right? If your goal is to end the conflict, how? How does military aid or non-military aid end the conflict? And how do you end the conflict? Is it that the Ukraine wins? Is it that you need to negotiate peace? if you need to negotiate peace, who has the better bargaining position? And who would the negotiation favor? What is the situation right now in the Ukraine? Is Putin winning? Is this just about holding off the Russian assault and making sure that Putin doesn't definitely win? Giving me what the situation on the ground is, what you think the situation on the ground is, puts you one step closer to winning this debate, because then I know why the outcome you're seeking is realistic. But a lot of teams didn't do that in this debate, and I think that is something that can be worked on. So, let's put it all together, right? Is there more money in the Ukraine? Pop would say, no, there won't be more money in the Ukraine. One that fairly fun argument you can run is that the US will pull out military aid if the EU is paying their fair share. You might cite Joe Biden and going like, oh, the NATO needs to pay up their 2%, you know. And then you might say that, hey, the Republicans are a bit fed up with funding the war in Ukraine. They want to cast the Biden administration as, you know, needlessly spending money, especially in light of the debt ceiling about to be reached. So all these hardline Republicans that control the House will sort of force the USA to pull out or give less money to the Ukraine if they have the excuse that the EU is already pumping money into Ukraine anyway. I think it's runnable. And I think what's interesting is that they'll mitigate a lot of what I might say about giving more money, right? Basically, you just say, well, you won't get more money because you lose that money from the US with whatever money you put into through the EU. Op does have a counter to that, and that's a terrible argument. And it is quite a terrible argument, right? Like, you have plenty of things you can say against it. You can say, but the US doesn't want to lose the influence battle against Russia, so they have no incentive to pull out, even if the EU puts in more money. You can say funding the Ukraine is a really popular political issue in the US. You know, both the Republicans and the Democrats are milking it for all it's worth. So even if some hardline right-wing Republicans go against it, it's likely to be passed in both the House and the Senate anyway. So, you know, get out of here, Prop. I think that's fair. So, interesting clash. Can go some places in some debates. Probably won't go very far in some other debates. Second potential question: is this additional money going to help the EU reach whatever your end game in inverted commas is in the Ukraine? One side might say no, it won't help at all because they are already in a good position with existing funds, so they don't need it. We're kind of happy where we are, right? We've reached a stalemate. The Donbass is lost, but everything else is solidly Ukraine's. So why do you need new tanks? We already have lots of money flowing in. The Ukraine can't even use all that money well because there are just not enough people to use those tanks. So you don't really need to put in more military aid that you already have in the country. The other side will probably paint a much bleaker picture, right? No, you know, Ukraine is losing. Ukraine has much less resources than Russia because Russia has a whole conscript army to throw at them. They need more resources. Their tanks are being damaged and blown up. This is a war of attrition. You need to replace equipment that has been damaged. Lots of good arguments there as well. So these two questions are about the practicalities of the money, right? Is there going to be actually more money? Is that money going to be spent well, or is it kind of a waste? Then you have questions about reactions, international reactions, right? So one big clash will be, what is Russia's reaction going to be, right? One team would say they'll come to the negotiating table because they know that they are losing. They know that the West isn't going to be giving up. They need to find some kind of a settlement in order for Putin to sort of get out of this war without losing too much, right, or risking his own power base, who might be getting increasingly disgruntled with the war. The other side will say, no, Putin will see this as an affront, right, to his authority. He'll be even more aggressive. He's already basically filled his cabinet with yes men. So he will treat this as invitation, right, to accelerate the assault. One big question, of course, is whether this is even possible. Does Putin have the funds to accelerate the assault? Can he actually do it? Will it actually work in the first place, given that his last assault went so badly? That could be a point of contention in the debate as well. Another question is, what is the effect on domestic and international relations, right? The US is quite unhappy about how little the EU has been doing when it comes to military assistance. This could persuade the US a little bit, increase and strengthen EU-US relations and ties. Smaller states might need EU assurance that, they are helping the Ukraine so that Russia doesn't get closer to their borders. Or they might be pissed off, right? Because, hey, why are you putting military assistance into the Ukraine when you should be spending more money on the European Defense Force for us, for our country, for my country, right? Why are you spending more money on tanks in the Ukraine when my country has literally no gas for the winter because Russia cut off our oil supply? You should be spending money on us, right? So there could be an effect on domestic and international relations as well. There's also, of course, the economic opportunity cost, right? If you're giving lots of money here, the economic costs could be your own people, their lives if you can't afford energy for them. If there's a lot of aid being sent, which might be the characterization of, a team that wants to say, we're sending in lots of money so that we can end the war really, really quickly, then the opportunity cost is quite high, right, to your own people. On the other hand, one could say that actually it's like, 0.3, 0.4% of GDP, even at the present amount. Like increasing it to 1% isn't going to kill anybody. We're not giving enough right now. We should be giving more. We have plenty of money to give. This isn't that big a deal, guys. So yeah, these are some interesting questions to ask, or at least interesting clashes in the debate that probably need to be explored by both teams in one way or another. So what will happen in the debate? What will happen is that by third speaker, you'll probably be winning on some arguments and losing on some arguments. That's kind of a very dirty thing to say. I'm sorry. And if you are a third speaker in that position, the goal might not necessarily be to win the arguments that you are losing on. Often because those arguments are the ones that your opponent spent a good week preparing for, writing rebuttal sheets against your best 3 responses. And all in all, it's what their entire case is and what they're most familiar with. Meanwhile, you heard that argument for the very first time, and you're like, oh gosh, like I didn't even think that this angle was possible, and that's their entire case. So is it possible to win in a prepared round? Yeah, of course it is, but it's hard. So if you find yourself in a position where you're losing on some arguments that you don't quite know how to win, consider this, right? Instead of winning the argument outright, weigh the argument instead, right? So why is one interest more important than another? The EU has many competing interests. You're winning on some of those interests, you're losing on some of those other interests. Few interesting metrics you can use to weigh an argument against another. One interest can be a precondition for another interest. So you might need to achieve one in order to start thinking about the other. Therefore, one is logically prior to the other. One interest can be more damaging in the short run or in the long run. And then you can go to short run, long run analysis, right? The long run matters more because it's a longer time scale and more people are affected. The short run matters more because it's happening right now and lots of things can happen in the long run, whereas the impacts on the short run is more definite. One interest could be more of an obligation than another, right? We might have a moral sense, an obligation towards one group over another, and that makes one interest more important. a moral obligation to your own people, perhaps, that voted for you or that pay taxpayers' money to protect the sovereignty of your state versus the lives of people elsewhere. Or, in the opposite world, a moral obligation to people who are suffering, who are born into conditions that they didn't consent to, versus your country that's a bit more privileged, where you don't need, where you don't necessarily need the comforts that you're used to if it means that somebody else somewhere is dying. A good grasp of these metrics will end up being debate winning between two relatively even matched teams. So if the strength of analysis is the same between the two teams, I would strongly advise the thirds to focus more on this weighing and these trade-offs. And probably during the 1 week prep, just spend time with your coach, going through how you're going to win the different trade-offs. Because it's going to come in really useful, not just in this debate, but in almost every debate that you take part in. So yeah, I know it's not a lot, but I didn't want to go into too much detail because it's a prepared round and you all should know stuff already. This is just a way of putting it all together. Hopefully you all enjoyed that and enjoyed my dry humor and sarcasm. Haha. And I'll see you around for the next one. Take care.